Hey, I'm Ryan Keaton, the student and college pastor here at First Baptist Church in Lexington. Here at First Baptist Church, we seek to reach out and minister to our community as best as we can, and we have started a new ministry to hopefully do that called Common Grounds. Common Grounds is a ministry that reaches out to the 20-somethings of Henderson and Decatur County to build community as we dive into God's Word together. You can visit us live at 14 Monroe Avenue on Tuesday nights at 7 p.m., or you can check out our YouTube channel, Common Grounds Lexington, and each week we'll update the lessons from the week past. Check us out, Common Grounds Lexington. So tonight we are continuing our series that we started last week, Be the Difference, moving from intention to action. Last week we talked about how to be joyful in a negative world. And so hopefully over the last week you've sought to be a more joyful person. You've tried to do the things that you need to do to bring joy not only to your life but to other people's lives around you. Tonight we're going to talk about the idea of being committed and this idea of commitment. So the question we're going to start with is this. Do you think that commitment is hard? Why or why not? This is the part in the lesson where you can talk back. Just in general commitment. It's hard. Why?
Because variables are thrown out. It's like, no matter what, we're going to do it. Or,
Okay.
you're going to stick to it.
Mm-hmm.
So everything else is just pushed to the side.
Yeah. So sometimes with commitments means that no matter the circumstances, you just got to stick with it, right? So what are some areas that you have commitments? What are something that you're committed in?
Nursing school.
Nursing school, yeah. So if you're in school, you're committed to that. Work. So yeah, you have obligations and duties and assignments, and you have a job and a commitment to show up and to do what you're supposed to do. Where else? Relationships. You have commitments and relationships to a person or to people or to things like that. Yeah, all of that is exactly right. And just the idea of commitment is being dedicated, having a responsibility, ultimately, and kind of like Carrie said, no matter what happens around you or to you, you're going to decide that I'm in this, and so I'm going to stick it out. Sadly, we live in a culture that I think is promoting and going to continue to promote a weak idea of commitment. If you look at the world around us today, there's not a whole lot of commitment in the world. Divorce rates are higher than probably ever before. You see it impacting the college football world, the pro world, where if a student athlete doesn't get what they want, they just transfer schools to another school and they just play for them. If they lose their starting job, I'm just going to transfer to another school I can play for. The idea of commitment is just not there like it used to be. You don't see in the pros that just player that sticks with the team for their entire career anymore. That's just not a thing that you see. You see people, and it is what it is, but they go to win. You play the game to win, but ultimately the idea of commitment is just not there. And we're seeing that just go across the whole spectrum of life. For example, we're getting ready to take our student ministry on a trip this weekend. And planning trips is one of the most horrible things in the world because people are not committed. They will sign up, they will even give you money, but that does not matter unless they're on the bus. You can't really count on their going. And so there's been people this week calling, hey, is it too late to sign up? Well, we've been promoting this for 6 months and we're leaving Saturday. Yeah, it's a little too late. Or like, hey, I can't go anymore. Can I get my money back? Like, sorry, no, we've already paid for this thing. So like commitment is just something that doesn't happen. It's just not something that is really important, I think, in a lot of people's lives anymore. So we're going to see tonight, how can we move from the intention of being committed to actually acting through on commitment, really as it relates to the church and our relationship with Jesus. Because it's the same thing in the church life. You see, if somebody doesn't get their way in the church, what do? They just leave and go to another church. If something isn't exactly how they want it, if things get tough, if somebody's feelings get hurt, They just run. They run from the problem. They're not committed to serving their local body. They're not committed to growing disciples. They just want their needs and their wants met. And if they're not, then they go and look for other places. We live in a very consumer-driven culture, and that's sadly impacting the church. And a lot of people, and even us, are guilty sometimes of putting our wants, needs, and desires before the church and before our commitment to God and our really commitment to our fellow believers around us. And so we're going to talk about tonight how we can become more committed, how we can be the difference in our own congregations and our families and our friend groups, and move from this idea of we have all the great intentions of being committed to Jesus, but how can we actually act through in those intentions of being committed? So we're going to be in Galatians chapter 6. We're going to read the first 10 verses there. They're on your sheet if you want to follow along. A little background on Galatians before we jump in. Paul writes this letter to the church of Galatia, who is pretty much like a problem child church to him. He goes to them, he preaches the gospel, they hear, they listen, they respond. But then after he leaves, other teachers come in and they try to throw in false doctrine. People are confused. They're making up rules that they're telling other people they have to follow. And they're just pretty much that person, that church that has all the potential in the world, but they just can't get out of their own way. And so this letter is almost Paul's reprimand, or his saying, like, what are you doing? Like, you had all of these great things going for you, and you took your eyes off of Jesus and put them on yourself. So how do we get them back on Jesus? So kind of keep that in mind as we dive into this. Chapter 6, verses 1 through 10. And my Bible has a little header that says, carry one another's burdens. And it says this: Brothers, if someone is caught in any wrongdoing, you who are spiritual should restore such a person with a gentle spirit, watching out for yourselves so you also won't be tempted. Carry one another's burdens. In this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone considered himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But each person should examine his own work, and then he will have a reason for boasting in himself alone, and not in respect to someone else. For each person will have to carry his own load. The one who is taught the message must share all of the good things with the teacher. Don't be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a person sows, he will also reap. Because the one who sows to his flesh will reap corruption from the flesh. But the one who sows to the Spirit will reap eternal life from the Spirit. So we must not get tired of doing good, for we will reap at the proper time if we don't give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, we must work for the good of all, especially for those who belong to the household of the faith. So tonight we're going to see three things on this idea of being committed. And the first thing is the reaping of commitment. The reaping of commitment. So Paul gives this analogy or this example of farming. Something that the people who read this letter would be very familiar with. Us in West Tennessee, we are still very familiar with this idea of farming and reaping what you sow, but we are kind of probably taken aback some from some of the other generations who probably grew up in this community. But we all can understand the concept of what you plant is what will ultimately grow. If you plant corn, guess what? You're going to get corn. You're not going to get soybean out of the ground because you planted a corn seed. And that makes a lot of sense to us. And in the same way, Paul is saying, you can't plant or sow things of the world and expect godly things to come out of it. So you can't plant selfishness and pride and lust and arrogance and expect to get love, joy, peace, and patience out of it. But so many times we do that. So many times we put all of our thoughts, all of our mind, all of our actions into things of this world, and then we're like, God, why aren't you blessing us? God, why aren't more things going my way? And it's from God's very word that he says, you can't continue to put in the ground of your life, in your heart, in your actions, in the people around you, these things that are worldly, and expect good blessings to come from it. But sadly, that's what we get. And this idea of the reaping of the commitment, we will ultimately get back what we put into it. And if we are committed then down the road we're going to receive great rewards from our commitment. But if we're not committed, guess what? We're going to receive consequences of not being committed. Take example, and I use this analogy a lot, but I think it's very well when it talks to the spiritual life, because we can just understand physical things sometimes better than spiritual things. If someone is committed to going to the gym, and they work out, and they're very conscientious about their diet and doing these things, they might not see immediate results, especially depending on somebody's body type. It might take a while, but once they start seeing results, it's compound interest. You just see that it grows, and they start getting more fit, they start feeling more healthy, and they start doing better things with their life and their physical nature just because they are being committed to making themselves physically better. On the opposite side of that, if somebody does not take care of themselves, if they let themselves just eat whatever they want, and they don't walk and these things, then they'll suffer repercussions from that. A guy that we have that comes and speaks at our church all the time, and who will be here at the end of February, a guy named T.J. Gillum, and he tells his own personal story where he was a bodybuilder at one point. He got a family, life got busy, and he blew up, gained a lot of weight. And what hit him was when he was chasing his son up the stairs. He got to the second flight of their stairs from their basement to their second floor, and he said that he felt like his heart was going to beat out of his chest. And he said, I got to do something with my life. I'm not going to be able to see my kids grow up if I continue down this path. And so he started a health journey that changed. And so if you sow those things of the physical nature, you'll reap great rewards. It's the same in financial investments. Right now, we're all in the 20-somethings. And right now, what we do financially will impact us the rest of our lives. If we choose to make wise financial investments, then when we get retirement age, we will be able to reap great benefits of those financial responsibility that we took in our 20s. If we put it into savings accounts and retirement funds and things like that, if we make wise choices on buying cars and houses and loans and credit card debt and all of those things, if we sow responsibility financially, then down the road when we're 60, 70, 80 years old, we'll be able to live a life that we couldn't have lived if we didn't. Dave Ramsey says, live like no one does now so you can live like no one can later. And this opposite is true as well. If we make poor financial decisions now, it's going to impact us for the rest of our lives. If we get in huge, soul-crushing debt, then we won't be able to live the life that we want to live down the road because we are really bound by financial burdens. The same is true of our spiritual life. Right now in our 20s, we are planting seeds that will impact us the rest of our lives. And so right now we can either sow things that when we get older and we start our families and we start having kids and raising them and those type of things, the decisions that we've made and are making right now will greatly impact those decisions down the road. The type of leadership we're able to offer in the church, all of those will matter. I think this question is interesting, and I'd like to hear your feedback, and that is this. And the idea of reaping is also kind of the idea of like a reward. So why are rewards not always a good thing? Yeah, so you just become so used to it that if there's no incentive, you're just not going to do it, right? Why else?
I was going to say kind of along the same lines, Nathan. It just becomes an expectation. So if I'm not going to get recognition, or I'm not going to get a bonus or whatever for it, then what's the point of me even doing the right thing at this point? So your moral level drops with that because there's nothing to benefit you except knowing that it's the right thing to do or the right way to address the situation you're in.
Anybody else? I think it could be a reward could be a false indicator of effort sometimes. Because school, athletics, however you want to say, one person could put in a lot of effort and try really hard and be rewarded the exact same as somebody who just puts in the minimum. And so over time, you almost could gain the mindset of what's the point of doing my best whenever I can just do as little as I want and get the same result as everybody else. And so this reward almost makes us lazy, kind of like you're saying, because you're like, what's the point of me trying as hard as everybody else if everybody gets the trophy? But at the end of the day, everybody goes home with the trophy. Everybody goes home with the A from class. Why put in the effort? Why do it all? And I think that's why it's hard in the Christian life sometimes, because we try to live for Jesus so hard, but yet we see people in the world around us that seem to be reaping better benefits than us. We're like, God, I'm trying to live for you, and I'm trying to make the right decision for you. And not only am I going to church on Sundays and Wednesdays, but man, I'm going to a Bible study on Tuesday nights, and I'm trying to live for you. I'm trying to do the right thing. And here's a guy over here who doesn't go to church, doesn't do anything, and it seems like his relationships are going great. It seems like his job financially, man, he's soaring, he's doing great things. And it's so easy to look at external rewards and think that God is blessing somebody else more than he's blessing me. And so it's almost like, God, why should I try? Why should I even put in the ultimate effort to live for you if I'm going to get the same reward as this other person? Because they say they're saved, but yet they only come to church once a month maybe, and they do these other things. And if we believe the same thing about salvation, then they inherit the same reward I do. So what's the point? The Bible tells us this in Matthew 5:44 and 45. It says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust, or he sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. What that verse tells us, or at least kind of how it spoke to me, is that I should pray for people that I don't like, or I should pray for people who I might be jealous of, or I might covet their things, be jealous, I want their things, because ultimately, the external reward doesn't necessarily always equate to the heavenly reward. And just because they might be blessed now doesn't mean down the road they're going to be. The Bible tells us that God gives good things to righteous and unrighteous people. And guess what? He lets bad things happen to righteous and unrighteous people. And so just because right now you might not be receiving the harvest or the reward that you think you deserve, one day, if you're doing the right thing and you're staying committed to Christ, you will. It might not be an earthly reward. It might not be the reward you're looking for. But one day in heaven, you'll receive the reward that you are due if you stay committed to following Jesus. His word promises that. And I guarantee when we stand before God one day, the reward of hearing from our Father, well done, thy good and faithful servant, will be way better than any earthly reward we could have ever received. Way better than any trophy that we would get dusty on a shelf, way better than any praise from a stage you could ever get. The reward that we would get one day from being committed to Jesus would be a far better reaping than we could ever imagine. A lot of the rewards of investing in other people's lives we might not ever see this side of heaven. Us pouring into people, praying for people, sharing the gospel for people. We might not always see the benefits of that. But one day, I truly believe that we could be in heaven. There could be somebody walk up to us and say, I'm in heaven right now because you shared the gospel to this person. Even though you didn't know it, they got saved and they shared the gospel to me. I think God might let us see little glimpses of rewards of that, of our work here on earth, if we stay committed to Him. I truly believe that we will one day receive a reaping on being committed here on earth far greater than we could ever imagine, because the Bible tells us that God takes care of those who are His. And so right now, you might be just discouraged because it seems like people around you are being rewarded far better than you, even though you're putting in the same effort. But the reaping of commitment doesn't always look the same. Just because you aren't receiving harvest right now doesn't mean God isn't noticing what you're doing. And it doesn't mean that the work you're not doing isn't important. So there's the reaping of commitment. Second, there's the relationships of commitment. The relationships of commitment. How does our interactions with others around us impact our level of commitment? How do you think? Our interaction with others around us, our relationships. So you get really quiet in here. So it could be twofold. It could either impact it in a positive or a negative way. So one of the greatest indicators, of 20-somethings who say that they fell out of church was either they moved off to college and never got plugged into a church. So they went from having great relationships in the church that they maybe grew up in or went to. When they got to college, they never were able to form those relationships again. 2, the church, they felt like the church was judgmental and hypocritical. And so they fell out or they stopped going to church because ultimately they felt like the people there weren't good people and they didn't want to be around them. And another one, number 3, is that the church became so political against their stance that they decided that they would rather just not go to church at all if it was going to impact them socially as much as it did and not that much spiritually. 3 of the top 10 reasons that 20-somethings left church had to do with relationships, relational issues. And in the world we live in today, people don't just go to church because it's the social norm anymore. It's actually the opposite. I think going to church is not normal. If you go to church, you are the exception to the rule rather than the rule, where that wasn't the case a few years ago. And that was another question. Why do you think church members are less committed now than in years past? And I didn't write that on the sheet. That's just something I wrote down for myself. Or do you think they are? Why do you think people are less committed now than they used to be?
Because like you were saying, it's not the normal thing to do. It's not what everybody does.
Yeah, it's just not what everybody does. It's just not the normal thing.
It's easy to get distracted more now than it was years ago.
So many, it's easier to get distracted. Yeah, you don't need a church to be connected anymore. Used to, right or wrong, the church was probably the social hub of the community. People would go there to see each other, to communicate, to see how things were going on. And so spiritual things aside, people would use church as just the meeting point of being able to have relationships. Now you have social media, you have all these other things. You can be connected without ever entering the walls of the church. But relationships are still very important when you think of this idea of being committed, because either you'll be like, the 50, 60% of 20-somethings who say they don't go to church because of relational issues. So either relationships inside the church hurt your view of the church, or they'll help you. Because there have been times where, I just didn't really want to do the things that I did, but because I was committed to a task and I was held responsible by others around me, I showed up and did things maybe I didn't want to do. For example, and this might sound bad, but we do faith evangelism on Sunday afternoons. That's what our church does, to go and reach out to our community. And there are many Sunday afternoons when my alarm goes off and I'm taking a nap. I would much rather hit snooze and just keep sleeping than go knock on people's doors that I might not know. But then I remember I have a team that is counting on me to show up and go out with them. Staff position aside, the fact that I work at the church, I have people on my team that are going to ultimately suffer because our team dynamic won't be the same if I'm not there. And so I'm committed to the team members in my group, and so I show up. We started a Wednesday night Bible study after church for some guys to where we just wanted to dive in a little bit more. There were days where I really didn't feel like reading the book that I was going to read, but I was like, I owe it to them, whether I'm teaching or not, to dive into this book and to read, because if we all want to grow together, I need to stay committed to this thing. And the same is true with you. You probably have things in your life where other people helped you, and they encouraged you, and they challenged you, and they held you accountable. And when you take yourself out of that accountability thing, chances are you won't be as committed as you were before. You see people who, when they fall out of a relationship, they fall away from church because they were held committed by their spouse or their partner to go to church whenever they were dating them or married to them. You see people who fall out of the gym whenever their workout partner stops going because they don't have that person that they're committed to showing up to help them to go anymore. And so relationships are an important part of our commitment for Christ, which means that if we truly want to live for Jesus, we got to. It is necessary for us to put good people around us who will encourage us and will hold us accountable to do the right thing and to stay committed. This whole passage that we just read was about the idea of carrying one another's burdens. Ultimately, as Christians, and just really as individuals at all, we weren't made to live life alone. God created us to be relational, ultimately relational with Him, but then also relational with one another. And when those relationships break down, our lives start to break down. When we have some kind of disconnect between us and God, we can tell that there starts to be a disconnect between us and other people. When there starts to be a huge disconnect between us and other people, we notice that there starts to be a disconnect between us and God, because we truly can't be fully in with God if we're harboring hatred or other things against people around our lives. Relationships are so important in this idea of being committed. It says that at the end in verse 10, it says that we must work for the good of all, for everybody. We're in this together. The Bible tells us, it uses the analogy of the body of Christ and how we all as a body work together as different members for the overall good of each other. And so it's very easy, and sadly, and again, we live in a culture that does this, we are too quick to throw people away in our life, or to throw people on the bus, under the bus when they mess up, or when they do things. In the church, and us as Christians, we should be some of the first people to offer that hand of forgiveness. And and the Bible tells us that there are circumstances where that, a relationship could just become so toxic that you do remove yourself from it. But we should always be willing to have a relational component to our commitment, and we have to remember that relational component. And in this whole idea, it is really easy, if we kind of go back to the first point, the idea of the reaping, to be in disconnect or disunity with people in our own churches or in our families or whatever, because we see them reaping different benefits than we are, and so we become jealous or envious or whatever, and so we cause a rift or whatever. We just put up walls between them. We don't interact with them like we should. Our relationships break down because we think that maybe we deserve better than they deserve, and so we just let those relational components break down. We let that commitment to the better of everybody break down, because the thing is, just because someone else succeeds doesn't mean that you're not succeeding. We're all in this together. We should all want everybody to reap benefits. We should want everybody to draw close to Christ, to come to a discipleship relational with Christ. And it's just easy in this competitive world that we live in, this dog-eat-dog world, to become so isolated and so focused on yourself as an individual that you forget that you were made for relationships. You were made to be in this thing together. And that's why I love something like this on Tuesday nights, because it doesn't matter the congregation you go to, the family you go to. Ultimately, we're here to encourage and to build one another up so that we can go back out into our jobs or our schools or our churches, and we can be encouraged and start filling other people up, because it's really easy to pour so much out that you don't allow yourself to be filled up by the things of God. And when you do that, you start running on empty. And when you start running on empty, you notice that your relationships start breaking down, and the things just don't work like they should. So there's the reaping of commitment, the relationships of commitment, and then thirdly, the reason of commitment. Why should you always remember your purpose of being committed? Why is the purpose important?
Because that helps you choose to be committed.
Yeah, so it helps you, your choice. I think it helps you make decisions. When you have the end game in mind, the decisions that lead to that ultimately are very important. So if you don't know your end game, if you don't know what ultimately you want to receive at the end, then you'll have no idea what steps to take to get there. For example, you want to get out of debt, for example. If you don't have a process to do that, you're just going to be spinning your wheels, spending your money, and you're never going to do it. But if you start saying, all right, I'm going to save $50 of my check every week, I'm going to put it back to go toward debt retirement, eventually you'll be able to do things like that. You have to have some kind of plan. You have to have some kind of end goal in mind. And so many times we forget the end goal in our Christian life, that ultimately we should do everything to bring honor to God, that we start just worrying about works and making ourselves look good, and our end game then becomes making ourselves look like good Christians instead of lifting up the name of Jesus. We turn, when we don't see in number one, we don't see those benefits and those reapings, our motivation no longer becomes other people glorifying God and us glorifying God. It becomes us glorifying ourselves because we get jealous, because we want the attention. And so we have to remember the reason on this. It says here we are to carry one another's burdens. We shouldn't try to live alone. I saw this quote that says, we serve and do not out of a sense of legalistic obligation. So as Christians, we shouldn't serve and do just because we feel like we have to, but out of an overflow of gratitude of what God has done for us through His Son Jesus. So the reason for us as Christians to do the work that we do ultimately isn't motivated for salvation. There's a lot of religions, there's a lot of even denominations maybe. You go and do the things you do so that God will find favor in your life and so that you will be blessed. And so their whole reason for going and trying to knock on people's doors and share the gospel or go to church is so that God will love them. And so if that's their reason, their heart isn't going to be in it like somebody else, like for the right reasons. Their motivations are wrong. But if your reason for sharing the gospel with somebody, if your reason for going to church, if your reason for singing worship songs, if your reason for in your job showing the love of Jesus is ultimately out of an overflow because you see how blessed you are to have a relationship with Jesus, and you know just how lost you were, and without that you know that you would be a lost sinner on your way to hell, if your reason then becomes motivated out of gratitude rather than obligation, then everything changes. And the reason of your commitment, the end goal, is so important. And so if you're just in it for yourself, then chances are you're not going to be as committed to Christ because your focus isn't on the right thing. But if you are committed because you ultimately see just how great of a task it was and what truly God did in your life, then it changes everything in your life. The reason for this commitment, it keeps us from doing what it says here in verse 9. So that we do not get tired of doing good, so that we can reap at the proper time if we do not give up. There's someone in here tonight, I'm sure you're about ready to give up. You might not be showing it on the outside, but inside, internally, you're like, I'm ready to throw in the towel, or I'm tired of continuing to do the same things I'm doing because I'm just not seeing the results. And as we kind of continue this entrance into 2019, however 2018 treated you, however you entered this new year, as you're thinking about resolutions and goals and things like that, you're also going to be thinking about your commitment level. And I would encourage you, be committed to Jesus, be committed to your church, and be committed to yourself to be the person that God has in store for you, not out of obligation, not out of because you have to, not because you want God to love you, but do it because you are so grateful and you are so thankful that God did what He did in sending His Son Jesus to die on the cross for your sins, that your actions and your attitude in your life is ultimately that overflow of thankfulness, to where you're saying, God, I'm going to be committed to you because you were committed enough to me that whenever I continue to sin and run from you, and every time that you bless me and I just don't thank you about it, and yet you continue to do it, God, that's why I live the life that I live. That's why I do the things that I do. Because ultimately, the greatest commitment in our lives is not our commitment to God, it's God's commitment to us. We serve a God who has always been faithfully committed to us. Even when we ran, even when we sinned, even when we turned our backs on Him, He never did that to us. God is the ultimate display and example of commitment. And because we have that example of commitment in our lives through a relationship with Jesus, we then can give a small portion of that commitment back to Him as we try to have faithful living. So tonight my question, and a question that you should just leave here with, is how can I be better committed, and why? Why should I be committed? So what are some practical things we can do this week to show God we're better committed? What do you think? What do you think are some ways you can practically show that you're better committed this week?
Sit down every single day and have a devotion.
So yeah, set aside time. You're going to say, God, all right, I want to show you that I'm committed. I'm going to start giving you my time. if I truly want to do this thing right, then I'm gonna block out time every day, and I'm gonna show commitment through my time. How else? Another big thing is your finances. We're getting in a part right now in our lives where tithing is an important thing. And two things that show what you're committed to is what you do with your calendar, what you do with your checkbook. Where are you spending your money? Are you tithing to your local church? Are you showing God that I'm going to be committed in this thing with my finances? Because one of those tough things right now is money is tight. Money is tight as 20-somethings. We're trying to get our feet off the ground. We're trying to pay off student loans. We're trying to pay for school. We're trying to save for a house or for marriage or for family or whatever. And so we feel like, God, I just don't have the resources right now to give back to you. Man, show that you're committed to Him and trusting the biblical mandate to tithe. Because it is that. It's a biblical mandate. Show Him, I'm gonna be committed to you through my time and through my money. And I promise you, you'll start reaping these benefits. This isn't some like God's going to give you a Ferrari if you give me $1,000 like nonsense. But this is just biblical truth that if you show God that your hands are open and that you're going to be generous to Him, He will be generous back to you. He will. And so, man, through your time and your money, those are two just simple, practical things that you can start doing this week to show God, I'm going to be more committed to you. I'm going to show you through my calendar and my checkbook that I want to live a life. And then after you have those things and you start getting where you're faithful at those things, find something else. Don't make a list that's too big that you get overwhelmed. Start small and then grow through those things. So if it's, God, this week I'm gonna Sunday I'm gonna write the check and I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna be faithful. Do it. If it's, today I haven't had my quiet time, so before I go to bed I'm gonna spend 10 minutes in God's Word. I'm gonna spend 5 minutes in prayer. Do that. But I would just encourage you, if you do spend that time with God, don't spend all the time talking. Spend time listening. Because there's people who say, man, I spent an hour in prayer today. That's great. You spent an hour talking to God. How much time did you spend listening to God? Give time for God to speak back into your life. Give time for God to direct you and to guide you. And those are very practical things that you can leave here tonight, and you can take those things and you can say, God, this week I'm going to give you my calendar, and I'm going to give you my checkbook. And through those things, I'm going to show you that in 2019, I want to be more committed to you. That's something simple that we can all do. And then that's something simple that we can start telling others to do, because you have people in your life that are looking at you for an example, whether you realize it or not. So you can start leading people in that front of saying, I'm trying to be more committed through this. Why don't we hold each other accountable, and you start trying to do it too. And before you know it, 2 could turn into 4, could turn into 8, 16, and before you know it, your whole friend group, family group, whatever, your church, man, they are doing better strides and steps to be more